Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. This is Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Doug.
So today we're going to talk about something that, again, always makes me feel embarrassed that I'm a historian, and I didn't realize that my absolute disdain for the Broadway musical Hamilton. I tried to watch it like 10 times in a row. I couldn't get more than a little bit into it because it was so improper and incorrect and completely making him out to be some kind of hero. No, Alexander Hamilton, who you're going to reveal today, I'm not going to take away that thunder because I want those words to come out of your mouth, because what you have put together for this, for basically what was the British continued control to this very day of American banking, you have the evidence. And it involves somebody who nowadays in movie is a superhero, a guy named John Carter. Oh, that's not his real name. So you have found the spy that perhaps, this Netflix movie, Washington Spies, was really talking about, since you have figured out the real history of Alexander Hamilton and the real history of the order of the way that banks in America tried to take over all of American economy. And this is, to me, a huge revelation. And you discovered a person who I had never, ever heard of, John Barker, who I had no idea would have been one of the most powerful men of his time. Maybe, if you want to look in the big picture, the most powerful person in terms of maritime trading, slavery, opium, laundering money, and the building of the foundation of banks to take over basically all economy. So this is an amazing thing you've discovered. Where do you want to start with the story?
I think that I'm not sure how we got into Hamilton, but um, I think that as we have been looking at banking, it was inevitable that we would then go to the formation of America and start looking at literally the facts of what happened and not the drama around musicals like Hamilton, which I think for most people is going to be all the history they ever look at with the American Revolution.
That is sad and true. And I'm going to now vomit being a historian myself here on the side.
Okay, so we just started asking the question. Okay, what after the revolution? What were the first banks? And then that led to this new Pandora's box, which really focused on one person, Alexander Hamilton. And what we then learned, to our surprise, was that the first bank that he helped establish was actually established during the fighting against the British. And in the process of establishing that bank, he got his brother in law to be one of the top two shareholders in that bank. And his brother in law was British. And at that time, they thought his name was John Carter. And only later, after Carter married his wife's sister, did we discover that his actual name was John Barker Church, and that John Barker, his uncle, was the governor of the London Assurance Company, which was a crown chartered monopoly that started in 1720 and was the chief, as you mentioned, the chief insurer of shipping and then fire and then life insurance for the whole planet. The crown owned the business. And in parallel, Lloyd's started as a private bank, but they were mainly handling unique cases. So the primary insurer of all the slave trade that we've discovered and all the opium trade and all the ships for that business, along with regular trade, was handled by this London Insurance Company. And his nephew was the one of the top two investors in the first bank that was created actually during the revolution. So the British were in our knickers right during the battles. The Battle of Yorktown had just happened when they founded this bank.
And even more so, who was it that got the military contracts for supplying Washington's army?
That's even more surprising. We find that it's the same John Barker Church, or John Carter, as they thought his name was, who it's now what we've learned is that when our bureaucrats want to misdirect the public, they will actually rewrite history. And what we see here is the history of this guy is actually embedded in the UK parliamentary archives. That's how deeply they went to lie about who this guy was and what he was doing in America. But as it turns out, the story goes that he was set up in business by his uncle. He squandered, that's the word I was looking for, squandered his stocks. He squandered his business opportunities, and apparently he was a gambler. Well, that sounds like most British aristocrats, if you ask me.
And
But
then
anyway,
he went bankrupt.
and then he went bankrupt, and all this is very well recorded in UK archives. And then he in 1774 he immigrates to America, and then magically within 2 years, right after the Declaration of Independence, he becomes the one of three chief commissars of the Continental Army. This Brit, where'd he get his money? I thought he had just lost it all. And all of a sudden, he's got money enough to supply the Continental Army. And then later, he actually got the contract to supply the French as well. So the story as it's written in the propaganda doesn't hang when you actually think about it. That a bankrupt individual can do these kind of things. Clearly, he was set up. Clearly, this money that was used to fight our war was coming from Britain, the same people we were fighting. Isn't that odd?
This is a soap opera that keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So you've now, that's the top, and then he became good friends with this person that we have deified in America, Alexander Hamilton. Ooh, and anytime we have a single question about the Constitution or anything about the federal government, the people in the federal government go get what? The Federalist Papers. Because why? He created the Federalist Party. And then later, Jefferson hated him so much he had to create the Jeffersonian Party just to shut him up. And then that party was shut up. But during that time, he became bunk buddies. I mean, good buddies. I mean, what kind of buddies, we don't know.
The history is pretty clear what was going on there.
Well, they actually, I was reading histories of the time when people literally made reference to the threesome, Lawrence, Hamilton, and Carter, who
Lafayette.
Lafayette, excuse me.
Carter would have been a fourth.
And then Carter's a fourth, who then basically did all of the globalist banker bidding because Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of Treasury. He was a Federalist. The Vice President Adams hated federalism. And so why would we believe Alexander Hamilton's idea that,
as did Jefferson?
Yeah, Jefferson hated it. Why? Because he said there should be no states. Wipe out the states. There should only be a national federalist government, and basically the person in charge rules everything. And we might allow like a parliamentary system like in England, as long as the lawyers still rule everything, right? So he was a corrupt British agent. He was a spy. So when you say Washington spies, like the movie Washington Spies, Alexander Hamilton was the top spy. And we know this because what was his agenda? Make me in charge of all money and setting up the entire economy for America. And I'm going to read one book. That's all he did. And then he's going two books.
He read two books.
He read two books. And then he's going to do what his British masters told him to do, which is create the same system we have here so that the first investors in the bank that creates the hopefully species currency. So we'll get the species, you get the fiat, and we get the interest on the fiat because you'll always keep needing more. You can never pay back the debt. It's called onerous debt. That was Alexander Hamilton's program. Now tell him how many banks was Alexander Hamilton involved in, because your list you just showed me is enough to send willies up my spine.
Yeah, I thought, okay, what bank was it? Well, let's try 4 banks. And the first one was the Bank of North America in 1781. The second one was the Bank of New York in 1784. The first Bank of the United States in 1791, and the Manhattan Company in 1799. And I've got a little chart here, which I'm going to hold up, and I hope you can see that. There we have the successors of these banks today. So for the Bank of North America, it's Wells Fargo. For the Bank of New York, it's Bank of New York Mellon. The First Bank of the United States is Bank of New York Mellon and Citizens, and the Manhattan Company is now J.P. Morgan Chase. So there we have the British agents today. There's no way around this. When these guys, I think at some point they must have decided, let's be really clever. Let's get our little John Carter guy. Let's send him over to the United States before everything locks down. So we've got our man in place, and then we'll give him enough money to go feed the army, and that will make them feel good about him. And then we will also give him to the French so we can feed the French as well, while we pretend to fight the Americans. And even though George Washington's going to lose every battle, it's going to be a miracle that he wins. And what ends up happening is John Barker Church becomes one of the richest men in America at the end of the Revolution. And then we see that John Barker Church is related to Hamilton. Hamilton and Barker Church married two Schuler sisters, and one of those was Elizabeth Schuler, and the other one was Angelica Schuler, and those become that becomes the glue, this interlocking glue of these blood dynasties that we are now very familiar with, that really took our republic down a federalist pathway. And what we now read from the histories is that both Jefferson and Adams and many people in New York actually called New York Hamiltonopolis. And that's a quote. And they called him America's chief Anglophile. And everything we see about his writing, he was just too eager to make sure that the banking system would end up being a fiat currency debt-based usurious system. There were other proposals out there, like the land bank was proposed as another way of capitalizing a bank. And after Hamilton had gone out and read 2 books on banking, he came back and wrote this 60-page treatise on why land banks are a bad idea and stupid. And he was actually ridiculing the guy who proposed it. And as a result, what we see is just he was like a fly. He was over everything related to banking to make sure it ended up the way the British wanted.
Oh yes, and this was a battle from the time of the Declaration of Independence,
Right.
when they took the word property out and inserted pursuit of happiness.
Yep.
And that's what this is all about. Alexander Hamilton, well, let me go back and recap, because what you just said is so profound, and I can tell you that nobody has connected that. And then there's a couple other things you're going to connect here today, about Warburg's and about Suffolk's Bank and State Street Bank, and the way all these banks became asset managers.
Right.
Now they don't even have to be banks. Banks are nothing. Banks can fail. They're asset managers. They're too big to fail when you're managing $7.5 trillion worth of assets. And that's the kind of companies that these groups became, right? So let's go back. You got a guy, John Barker. He and Lloyd's of London control, basically. I loved it. Jefferson used a word, it was a derogatory term that he called Alexander Hamilton, and it was monocrat. So that it
Right.
implies monarchy as well as a monopoly.
Right. They saw it
for corporations, right? It's like,
Right.
corporations, they can't be held responsible for anything, and then banks, oh, well, banks could do whatever. Banks are the house for gambling. They always win. That's the way it's always set up, of course, right? They don't have the same rules as gamblers have. I call these people the worst gamblers in history. So when you're talking about John Barker, basically the monarchy said, yeah, you could have a monopoly. And as you pointed out, for what, 30 or 35 years, he was in control of the sea, the British Sea, when it was at its height. And they were doing all their dirty deals with opium in Turkey, all the way to China, getting the Chinese addicted to kill them, bringing back slaves, killing a lot of them, bringing back silver and mercury, doing all this stuff. And the Levant group was centered out of Boston. And even
Right.
though this guy, John Barker, he controlled all the insurance for all ships going everywhere. In other words, he knew what was aboard everything. So if there was going to be the ultimate pirate on the seven seas, it was
He's it.
John Barker. What did he do
Correct.
before he was in charge of all insurance for these ships? He was in charge of the lighthouses. And he was a port, what do you call it? Like the port authority. He was the
Right,
head.
which was a big deal back then. That was like GPS today. It was the only way they got safely into the harbors.
If he turned off the lighthouse, the ship wrecked.
That's
And
right.
he knew what was on board, and he could make up ships going down that didn't. And since he was the director, he was able to do side deals, I'm assuming. And so he knew he was the biggest slaver of all.
No, they were allowed to do side deals. That was
Yes.
a part of this aristocratic system. So they could be managing something for the government, but the government let them do side deals, just like Pelosi does today and the members of Congress.
It's so sad, so sad. But I'm going to try to stay on topic because I want to talk about the Hanseatic League, where they got some of these ideas, because the British weren't original ever. They always copied everybody. But the point is that here they are. They're in charge of the seven seas. They're in charge of this trade. They're in charge, basically. He would have been in charge of the results of the war between the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. This guy, or the results of it is, and then the British Empire that absorbed it, and the Dutch Empire, and then the battle between the West East India Company in New York and the British East India Company in Boston. Had kind of a war. And recently you just discovered and brought this all forward with the help of the miners to show that the Bostonians, the elite Bostonians who were really loyalists, who were monarchists, monocrats, as we could call them, at one point they wanted to say they were loyal to the king, and then later, oh no, we want to be on our own, create our own corporations, create our own churches, create our own money, create our own banks. And pretty soon, through the opium trade, through the Levant Company, which of course John Barker would have known all about every detail of the Levant
He was
Company.
insuring all the ships.
He knew more than anybody, right? He's probably
Right.
the only person who knew all of that. And so he
Right.
completely controlled that. And so what was happening in the battle of these corporatists who moved to America under the guise of pilgrims and colonists, they became bankers based upon the opium trade, built up, and that's where Alexander Hamilton ended up
You need
living.
to say slave and opium.
I'm sorry, got to
Because
say
the
the
ships
slave because
went
they
out
killed
with
people.
opium, came back with slaves.
Alexander Hamilton was a slaver himself, in that he was a bookkeeper, wasn't he?
He was a clerk and we actually have the newspaper article where they're advertising 300 slaves that he did the logistics on. So it's no question he was a slaver and was very familiar with the slave culture of sodomy and rape and beatings and cutting arms off and all that kind of stuff. And that's interesting aspect of the Hamilton musical. They don't talk about slavery at all. And so therefore you have this impression that somehow Hamilton was apart from that.
He was raised in slavery. He was sent to get his education by slavers. They paid for it, and he went to
Right.
King's College, wasn't it?
Right,
King's
which is now Columbia.
College. Oh, now they disguised it with a propaganda name, Columbia, which means free Americans. No, King's College. And really, when it comes down to it, the War of 1812 was because of a battle over trade issues between Britain and America and France. So
Right.
there's a whole war, and during this war, and even before it, Hamilton was always for the British. He wanted to give over our banking system, and look how many times he tried. And in fact, he did in the end. Those banks are the banks that will be the private banks. But then really, it was Brits, the Warburgs, who basically got central banking going here in America in 1913 after it failing for years before that. And once the central bank was set up, well, that's it. Who bought into the central bank? The bankers. All those banks you just had listed, Wells Fargo and all those banks, they bought into the central banks. And so they actually owned the central banks. And so they owned the debt of America.
Right.
And banks were created to handle the debt of war, and it was a tax given out to all people. It's still going on, folks.
So if we want to know the names of the major investors from Europe in our banks, our first four Hamilton banks, it would be the Warburgs, the Barings, the Rothschilds, and I'm leaving somebody out. Um, Barker, the London Assurance Company. So we had numerous corporations in Europe that were also investors. But what we see as a looming larger than life figure in all of this work to set up these banks, we see this John Barker Church. And let me just give you an example of why we haven't heard of him. When we actually looked at the histories, we do see him in certain histories and we don't see him in other histories, or if we do, it's downplayed. And so I actually was just looking at an interview that one of these historians did with the playwright for Hamilton, and he asked him, why didn't you talk about slavery? And he gave him a really confusing answer. But anyway, the problem is in that particular history, when they're talking about Hamilton, we found John Barker Church mentioned once in a footnote in a list of the first directors of the Bank of North America. That's it. He doesn't give any other context. He doesn't talk about Barker Church's role in the supplying the Continental Army or anything else. No context at all. Mentioned once. And so what we now see is that there is a pretty strong effort by certain historians to make sure that there's a big distinction between Hamilton and his relationships and the banks that we have today, and how closely they're aligned with British interests and always have been.
Well, your little mythology story, I mean, fairy tale story, is how they always tell that story. When the Rothschild agents start off as tellers, and by the time they reach America, they start a bank in New York that becomes one of the largest banks in the universe. We're
Yeah,
supposed to believe that. Oh, so we're supposed to believe that bankrupt John Barker Church, who becomes the spy, John Carter, who becomes Alexander Hamilton's handler, British handler, and of
right.
course Alexander Hamilton and John Carter. I'll call him John Carter because it gives the mystique to it. They're British spies. Okay, let's make it absolutely clear.
There's no question in my mind.
And federalism is nothing more than British globalism and corporatism. So
Right.
monocrats, I just love that term because these are pilgrims. Now, look at good old John Carter. Where did they send him for training? The place they always send them for training to become a pilgrim. Columbia University, King's College. You want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, when Hamilton was emigrated from St. Croix to Boston and then New York, he was funded by British slavers in St. Croix to come to New York and be schooled, and his schooling was paid for at King's College, Columbia University, and then immediately, pretty soon after he graduated, the war started, and so somehow he got onto George Washington's staff, which is an interesting move. Okay, I don't know how that happened. I haven't looked that deeply at it yet. But then here he's just a young kid, he's like 24, 25 years old. And then here we see him working on the staff, and he got frustrated during the revolution that he didn't have a command, and so he kept pressing Washington for a command, and Washington wouldn't give him one. And then eventually, toward the end of the war, they did. But by then, he had already conceived of this Bank of North America, had pressed it, had read those two books, so he was an expert now. And then he formed it with the money from his brother-in-law, John Carter. And by then, he was still John Carter. And by the way, that name was an alias that he created in London, and that's actually recorded in the UK Parliament archives. And so the story is he was ashamed of his gambling past and therefore wanted to make a new start in the U.S. Oh, they didn't mention. Well, they did mention actually that he was the nephew of John Barker, but there was no connection that maybe he was Barker's agent in the U.S. and this was the British spy who was going to make sure that whether the Brits lost or won, they were going to win the banking war, and that's what happened. He became by 1790, early 1790s, he became one of the richest men in America. Now, who knew?
Well, who knew that the Morgan family could turn into the biggest bankers around? Who knew that those Rockefellers, by selling some lamp oil, could turn into the Seven Sisters, who still control the economies of many countries? But I think it's most interesting to go back and see that. What was it? 1694, the Bank of England was founded, and so the Dutch
Right.
moving out of Germany, moving out of Savoy, moving out of Bologna and Venice, they came up, and I think you're going to be revealing. I'm not going to give this spoiler about what you might be talking about in the near future, which should blow people away, because the history of banking has been so well hidden. Though I've done quite a bit of research on it for years now, I recently came across some of the most astounding facts about central banks. So really, you could say that Alexander Hamilton was pushing for a central bank. A bank
Yes.
where the government holds all the species, so they can do fractional banking, do whatever they want with it, and give out fake fiat currency, which they can always print more of because it's just paper, but they control the debt on that. Well, that's what he was pushing for in all of his banks. And so by the names of them, at first, they were New York banks, in contradistinction to the Suffolk Bank and the State Street Bank, which later became State Street Asset Management Company, one of the largest criminal economic cabals in history. And so you have this tension between Alexander Hamilton living in Boston. I think, and I'm going to speculate, that the nephew of John Barker, the insurance guy who was in charge of the Levant's opium trade, needed a way to bring that money back into America. And so John Carter was probably very controlling of the money going into the dirty money being laundered through Boston for the opium trade and slave trade. And then on the other hand, you have Alexander Hamilton, who was the counterpoint to that in New York. And then you get the battle between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. And then you get two duels between Aaron Burr trying to kill off the North in Boston and the South Hamilton.
Well, let's refine that a
joke.
bit. Let's refine that a bit, because that duel that killed Hamilton occurred after another duel, which occurred on the very day that the Manhattan Company was founded, and that duel was between Aaron Burr and John Carter, or John Barker Church. So,
who was helping found his?
Who was actually one of the major shareholders and directors of this new Manhattan Bank.
Yes. And they wanted that to
be, this is all about money.
And they wanted that to be the national bank. Remember how Suffolk Bank in Boston tried to buy the banks in Washington so that they could handle the national banking interest out of Boston, okay? Same thing with New York.
The first bank of the United States was the first bank to issue currency, and that was going in 1791. Manhattan Company was 1799, and that was Aaron Burr and Hamilton and John Barker Church. So here we have these. By then, people were accusing Hamilton of double dealing and self dealing. So it wasn't just us that could see this. This is obvious. So Hamilton has to go out of his way to issue these pamphlets where he says, I'm innocent. I didn't trade on my information in any of these banks ever. Trust me. He actually published pamphlets. There was a scandal. And we know today that how can you not be tempted to use your inside information when you've been the founder of 4 different banks?
Yeah.
Come on.
Also, he's the head of the U.S. Treasury.
And the head of Treasury as well. He
hired 1,700 people to work underneath him to basically spread the propaganda to all the merchant banks and the bankers so that they would have basically a cabal. They'd have an organization that he would be the head of. And out of you doing that for years, then he said, now I'm going to create a political party called the Federalists, and we're going to end all the states, put the federal government in control, and we're going to have one bank, and everything's going to be run through who? That would be him.
Right.
Oh, nothing crazy about this guy, and nothing crazy about John Carter, the spy, who, just like so many of these fake relatives or compatriots of the rich bankers who can't come open the banks themselves, they have to send somebody else. John Carter having all that money is the clearest statement of fraud, British fraud on American
Right.
banks that you could possibly ever imagine. Now, follow that on through, and you'll see that the very banks they became the banks that bought into the central banks, and those are the banks. And who owns that? The Federal Reserve basically owns that. And who are those? Those are the same banks. And now
Right.
asset management companies that have arisen out of those banks.
Correct.
That's
Yeah, that's
incredible,
the sequence. There's been no break in this sequence. We can now see that our American Republic was hamstrung from inception, actually during the revolution. It started. So I don't remember which Rothschild said, I don't care who runs the government as long as I control the banks. But that person could have easily said it during this period, because that is in fact the way it's been ever since.
Oh, yes. Some will say we didn't win the American Revolution because Yorktown was not a true surrender of the British, and then they continued, and then the War of 1812, which lasted for years, they burnt down Washington, D.C. It was all about trade and banking, and particularly merchant ships. These were embargoes, and these embargoes are what caused in the problems. And what were the British really saying? If you're not going to give us our National Bank of America that we control from Britain, through people like John Carter and people like the Rothschilds, the minute they got into fiat currency being created off of a bank that had species, the Rothschilds got in. Okay.
Right.
And we can guarantee that all the way along, this is nothing more than the same old gamblers betting and trying to get control of the economic system so that the bet will always go to them. The
Right.
house determines how much money can be won on any one day in Las Vegas. Okay. So gambling is one of the oldest sins that there is. And we are talking about with the stock market, with these bankers doing fractional banking and let's not forget Moses Montefiore and people like him. The brokers are the ones. Look at John Carter. He's a broker. So when I say banksters and brokers, I am pointing at John Carter and an Alexander Hamilton, the banksters and their brokers, because these fake fraud brokers who come in and play like they're not actually representing the other bankers who are just trying to take over all banks. Well, they're lies, and that's just fake. John Carter, one of the best, most perfect examples of that in history. And once again, you and the miners, I swear you ought to give them the weekend off sometime, because the work that you guys
are this
pull up,
weekend.
You're going to celebrate?
Yes, we are.
What, you going
This
to come
is
over
Easter
to the light?
weekend for us.
Oh, that's right. You're going to take them to a 3.5-hour Russian Orthodox service where they have to stand.
No, I'm not flying to Moscow.
So I just told someone I'm
to
coming to St. Petersburg, and he's going to be surprised to hear that, but I'd like to go. You've been there.
John Carter, after the revolution, one of the things he did after forming all these banks and investing in all these banks is he moved back to Europe. And he actually became a member of parliament in Britain for about 7 or 8 years. And that's where we have a lot of the parliamentary records in their archives. And during that time, he became a gambling partner with none other than the Prince of Wales. So, the Prince of Wales just doesn't play cards with anybody. So clearly the Prince of Wales knew who was buttering his bread and made sure he took care of him. So here we have this, as you say, a spy in our midst, and he was at the highest circles. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin all knew who he was. They all knew this game he played with his previous name, Carter, and his real name, Church. They knew all these things. So that's the uncanny aspect of this, that the traitor of our country's ambition to be free was known to those that were trying the hardest to make it.
Hmm.
And in the end, it looks like if we don't do something about this system, Carter could win.
Oh yeah. And basically, the battle was between Brits and the American Revolution. It was between the British loyalists and then those corporate people, those monocrats who wanted to start their own bank and get in on it and get their piece of what they see from the aristocracy
Right.
going on in Britain. They're just trying to buy into the old system that's been going
Yep.
on since basically 1500 when, uh, well, I'm not going to spoil your perhaps your future research, but Anselmo del Banco. Follow that, folks, and you're going to follow what we're talking about. This started in 1500. This is a plot, it's a plan to turn the central banks into the controlling mechanism for economic predatorism
Right.
in all nations under the guise of, it's a good thing. It's globalism. It's asset management. What could be wrong with transnational asset management of trillions of dollars in BlackRock and Blackstone and State Street and T. Rowe and Vanguard and who's the other one?
Well, I
Yeah.
think the main problem is you only give money to your friends. And so therefore you only reinforce the sin that these people are pitching. And that is what we now see has been occurring since about the 13th century or maybe earlier. Um, and we see the same families. And then one of them actually sold property to the original Schwab, going back to the 13th century. So yeah, it's about money. It clearly is about money,
But this is
and
staggering what you've revealed.
it's just
It's
it blows my
staggering.
mind.
I love
Um,
Boston until you revealed the fact that
look
it's
at
opium heaven. It was built on opium money, the death of Chinese people
look at that.
and English people.
The
Yeah,
first, there are other banks, but those were the first primary ones.
those banks can't be stopped.
The $1 Million Bank was another one that I didn't put on this list because it was sort of a side issue. But the banks can't be stopped, and the Brits have been pushing them. The Bank of England has been supporting them from the beginning. And so they literally have been driving America from the checkbook.
Yeah, and I want you to talk about the fact that the Levant Company, which was a British corporation, but really ran the opium slave trade out of Boston and the places on the East Coast, that the owners of that ended up not even living in Boston when the war started. They went back to their true allegiance, which was Britain. And what did they do? They had a great time, like John Carter, spending American stolen money off of the death of slaves, off of opium trade, off of laundering money through those things, through our banks, and then pushing into a bank system that controls all of us. And
Right.
continuing the War of 1812, continuing the war, the Civil War was backed by the South, was backed by the British, and then the British have not left, folks. And if you think they have, look around, and you'll hear people everywhere speaking as if they're authorities with a British accent, trying to tell you what you're supposed to think. You'll see that the Brits are in all the top positions. You'll see that the SES is nothing more than an exact copy of the British aristocracy, where you take vows to follow what you're told, not to think. You're not paid to think. The senior executive service members that control the 56 branches of our federal government, which was basically created by Alexander Hamilton, the Federalists, who his party only lasted, what, 10 or so, 10, 20 years? Why? Because it was, no one wants that. No one wants the monarchy of Britain moved here under the auspices of corporatism or monocrats. No one
Right.
wants that.
We've just run across quotes from Jefferson, where they were discussing whether they put the capital in New York or in Washington. And Jefferson was against putting it in New York because he saw that as simply a haven for the British crown, and saw Hamilton as its chief proponent. And so I think that's why we haven't seen a complete takeover, because there were a lot of forces out there fighting against Hamilton and the federalism. But in the end, political philosophy is one thing. The guy controlling the money has really got the leg up on making sure this agenda gets where it needs to be, and then you can feed your friends. And they already saw that back in New York in the day. The people who weren't Federalists were finding that they weren't able to get their bank loans, and they were concerned that this was going to destroy this young republic, and which it seems that it has. So this is what it is. I don't know how this is going to get used, but clearly we've never had a republic free of this overarching British financial interest.
Oh, I think it's, if you had a radical approach, you could clear it up pretty clearly. No fractional banking, no money leaving the country without paying taxes into offshore accounts. That right there, solve everything. Pay taxes on all of your purchases during the year on the stock market. Because what we're talking about here is the perfect example of Moses Montefiore and uh, would that be NM? That'd be NM Rothschild, right? His
And
buddy.
then was with Moses, yeah, at the
Yeah.
same time.
That's a banker and a broker together. That means pure evil. What that really means is the broker is going to do the deals that he shouldn't know about that the bankers tell him about, because bankers know where the money goes and bankers know ahead of time what's going to go and what's not because they bank on it. But if you tell a broker and then the broker bets on it, whether on the stock market or in bonds or anything else, that's pure evil. That's
Yep.
making money from nothing. And that's who Alexander Hamilton was. He wanted to make money from nothing. John Carter, make money from nothing. Uh, John Hull. I like John Hull from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He just went out and because they had a lot of certain type of tree, I think it was a maple, he just cut it down and made coins made of wood that were shillings. That's really it's a joke because we don't know what money really is. And when we do, we're going to realize that the evil merging of banking and brokers basically means that ruthless people who don't mind putting you in jail, like the Babylonians and the Sumerians did, but those ruthless people forget to tell you about the year of the Jubilee, which the Jews have. When a Jew loans a Jew money in the old days, if they couldn't pay it back after 7 years, the loan was forgiven. In Hammurabi's time in Babylon, 3 years, that's the length, that's it. You go to set the debtor's prison for 3 years, then you're always forgiven. Not here in America. A corporation never goes to jail even if they kill people. Banksters, if they go bankrupt, they're never blamed for anything now, are they? I think one time, the Swiss banks were blamed for their Swiss bank accounts, and besides that, a few charges to people working at a clerk on a desk, right? Besides that, the banksters never get charged. The brokers, no one even wants to talk about the brokers. There's 5 brokers in New York City that do almost all the deals for the central banks. Who said? Why should those German bankers who came over as poor and made their way from the bottom up, and then therefore it's okay? You can be a robber baron in America as long as you worked from the bottom up in your fairy tale story, in your propaganda, right?
Right.
Which is what we hear all the time. So, Kuhn Loeb and Schiff and Esta and the list goes on and on. These are ferocious bankers who Europe outlawed at one time. Bankers should be outlawed because they don't have to follow the rules that you have to follow, that if you don't follow, you get put in jail. Okay? They don't go to jail. Do you know that when you put your money in a bank in America, except a community financial center or something, credit union. And what happens? You sign a contract saying the bank is your partner. They're going to hold the money, but they're going to fractionalize it. And right now, you can fractionalize into beyond. You don't even have to hold $1 of the $100 I put in there. Not one. Fractionalized to the point of insanity. And then the banker gets to invest. And if the banker's investments are bad and the bank goes belly up, they keep your money. You have no rights. Does anybody know that? I mean, read your agreement. Okay. That was probably written by Alexander Hamilton, more than
Well,
likely, because
probably.
that's the kind of theft of your liberty and freedom based upon property management and basically you as an economic slave. And that's what we're still dealing with. The major owners of our US Federal Reserve are the big bankers that came from Britain. Simple as
Well,
that.
it stands to reason that if the British were no doubt hedging their bets, and London was the chief institution for betting, And so we've read through the parliamentary records prior to the revolution. And, the business of America would come up from time to time, but it was certainly not the only thing on their plate. But as that started heating up, at some point, the risk guys within the London Insurance Company no doubt decided they needed to send somebody over to make sure they could cover all of their interests in the United States. And that became this John Carter guy, the nephew. And so they had to make up a fake story about why he went to America. And then magically he gets the contract to supply the Continental Army and then the French Army. And then he becomes a chief investor of 4 different banks, all organized by Alexander Hamilton. So they've controlled their strategy down to a blood relative. And that's what we've always seen. It's always blood. They never go out beyond that. And so then somehow he ingratiates himself with one of General Schuyler's daughters. He had a big family and got married to her. Actually, they eloped. And Schuyler didn't even know his real name at that point when they eloped. And then a few years later, Washington is having dinner with General Schuyler, and Hamilton's there with him. He meets Elizabeth Schuyler, and that's very prominent in the Hamilton story on the musical. And then there we have the British spy. Probably couldn't believe his luck that Hamilton would show up and he would be able to recruit him through the blood of Schuyler's. And by the way, the Schuyler name, the church name, they've all passed down to the current day. And so therefore this treachery that has certainly stained the intentions of the Republic are still with us today. Nothing has slowed down.
It's just amazing that you found it. I remember when we were chatting about your discoverings with the Boston Brahmin elite group, and you're going, and then there's this strange guy, John Carter. You kept mentioning his
Right.
name. Well, he shows up over here, and he shows up over there, and then he's shows up over there, and then he's marrying this what, and then he gets these contracts, and where do you get the? But everybody knows Washington had nothing, so the guy giving him things had to pay for it.
Right.
That's real easy to figure out.
That was
Where did he get the
Carter.
money? And why is he hanging out in Boston? And why does no one know where he is? And why does he go hidden for a while and show up? And there's mythological stories about him, about this and that. And you're going, come on, that stinks. That stinks like the British intelligence, as it were. And so what is he? Well, he's probably an intelligence agent for who? The British East India Company. And who would the British East India Company be in the pocket of? John Barker, the guy who gives them insurance, because nobody goes out on a boat without insurance. It's a gamble. The winds actually probably have the odds on it. The ocean probably ultimately wins over the long run. So this guy knew that, and he was getting all this blood money from opium and slave, and he needed to invest it in the best investment going right now, because hardly anyone was regulating what was going on in America. So I'll just send my nephew over there, and he's going to, sally up to anybody he has to. First off, just as a commoner and the guy who just came out of the forest. I think they referred to him once as the Indians knew of him and didn't really know what to make of him either. Like, why was he with the Indians? Because the War of 1812 was about getting the Indians to turn against the colonists so the British could take control. That's what the War of 1812 was. On the land, but bigger was the trade. They wanted to stop all of those ships in the Levant group and all that trading that was going on, because it was competition through the British East India Company, which ultimately is for the British Empire. So what we see here is literally the real story that should have been put on the stage for Hamilton. The story of treachery, of deceit, of treasonous what do you call the person who that you should hang? Well, for treason, sedition, and a spy. I mean, he should have hung. Aaron Burr should have hung, and John Carter. They should have hung him, take him down, and hang him again under his real name, John Barker Church. He should be hung twice. Okay, And then we get to see what this argument that was going on between the founding fathers. Recently in our discussions, I kind of came to the realization that my accepted standard sub-theory of American Revolution, that it was a Masonic revolution, that it started off in the Green Dragon Inn in Boston, and that Joseph Warren, the head of the army that fought the British to begin with, was the head of the Masonic, he was the Grand Master of the lodges in America, and Boston was a home of it. Well, let's remember, most of those people were British or Scottish, and they'd made they'd sworn a fealty, they'd sworn their life to this stuff. So who was fighting who? I think that probably within the Masonic order, I now imagine that there was the loyalists and the colonist Masons, and
Mhm.
they were fighting tooth and fang, like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, uh, fighting Alexander Hamilton and John Carter. Within this, or John Adams, look at the polarity between John Adams and Hamilton. They could have choked each other. They both said the opposite things, and they both had to work in the same cabinet underneath Washington. And it was obvious to see that Alexander Hamilton was just there for his own greed, self-interest. You have all those beautiful words, graft, grifting, and all that good stuff, right? And here's John Adams, like this really nice guy, right? Trying to do the best and create a very idealistic country. But from the beginning, the rats got in. And now that you've revealed it, it's just about time that we rewrote the history to make Alexander Hamilton not the head of the wonderful Federalists, but the head of the treasonous Brits.
Yep.